I've been watching congressional hearings for a long time. The pattern is almost always the same. Republicans defend their side, Democrats attack, everybody goes home. The whole thing is theater, and everybody knows it's theater, and that's fine. That's how it works. So when I tell you that something genuinely different happened at a House Judiciary Committee hearing on February 11th, I need you to understand that I don't say that easily. Because what unfolded in that room wasn't just unusual. It was the kind of moment that, once you see it clearly, rewrites the story you thought you were following. A Republican congressman, not a Democrat, not a maverick independent, stood up during an oversight hearing, faced the Attorney General of the United States, and accused her directly of breaking the law, of covering up the identities of men who may have committed crimes against children, of being personally responsible for one portion of a cover-up that, in his words, spans decades and is bigger than Watergate. And the Attorney General's response was to call him a failed politician with Trump derangement syndrome. I'm going to need you to hold both of those things in your head at once, because the contrast between what Massie said and how Bondi responded is the story. Not just for this hearing, for something much larger that's been building for months. Let me introduce you to Thomas Massie, because if you don't know his background, what happened next makes no sense. Massie is a Republican from Kentucky. He is currently serving his 8th term in Congress. He has a degree from MIT. He describes himself as a constitutional conservative. He voted with the Trump administration the majority of the time in the last session of Congress. He is not, by any honest measure, a Trump critic. He is a lawmaker who built his reputation on a very specific principle: that Congress has oversight responsibilities, and those responsibilities don't expire when a member of your own party is in the White House. For roughly 6 months leading up to this hearing, Massie had been doing something that attracted almost no national attention. He was quietly working, alongside Democratic Representative Ro Khanna of California, to force the Department of Justice to comply with a law that Congress had actually passed and Trump had actually signed. That law, the Epstein Files Transparency Act, required the DOJ to release documents from the federal investigations into Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell, with very limited redactions. Names of victims could be protected, but the identities of alleged co-conspirators and people under investigation were not supposed to be withheld. The DOJ missed the December deadline. Then they released 3 million pages in early February, a number Bondi repeated at the hearing so often it became almost its own punchline. And when Massie and Khanna actually went to the Department of Justice building to read the unredacted files, sitting at one of 4 available computers under the supervision of DOJ staff, they found something. 6 names. Men whose names appear in the files in connection with Epstein, some listed as potential co-conspirators by FBI investigators, had been redacted in key documents. Massie named them on the House floor. The DOJ then unredacted those names, including Leslie Wexner, the billionaire businessman and former CEO of Victoria's Secret, who is mentioned over 4,000 times in the files, and whose name appeared in a document identifying him as a potential co-conspirator of Epstein. Wexner has consistently denied wrongdoing, and his representatives say he cooperated with law enforcement. But his name, and others like it, had been blacked out. So at the hearing, Massie pressed Bondi on this. Specifically, he showed the documents. He pointed to the redactions. He laid out the timeline, that the names were only unredacted because he and Khanna had publicly identified them first. "Within 40 minutes of me catching you red-handed," he told her. And Bondi's response was, "This guy has Trump derangement syndrome. You're a failed politician." Read that back if you need to. A sitting attorney general, under oath, before a congressional oversight committee, responding to a specific legal challenge from a member of her own party by reaching into a binder of pre-prepared personal attacks and reading them off a flashcard. Because here's what Massie noticed, and immediately shared on social media. Bondi wasn't improvising those insults. Her staff had literally prepared individualized attack lines for each committee member in advance. For hours, during a 5.5-hour hearing, she could be seen flipping through the binder to find the pre-written insult that matched the lawmaker who was speaking. The term that stuck, offered by Democratic ranking member Jamie Raskin, was burn book. But Massie's term was more surgical. He called it flashcards. Staff literally gave her flashcards with individualized insults, he posted, but she couldn't memorize them, so you can see her shuffle through them to find the flashcard's insult that matches the member. That detail, that the insults were scripted, prepared, and delivered from notes, says something about the approach Bondi brought to what was supposed to be an oversight hearing on the handling of a child sex trafficking investigation. Not answers, flashcards. I'm genuinely curious whether this lands the same way for everyone watching. Does this register as normal congressional theater or as something different? Drop a comment. Now here's where the hearing escalated into territory that I didn't see coming, and neither apparently did most of the people in that room. After the hearing ended, a Reuters photographer captured something. In one frame from earlier in the hearing, Bondi is visible holding a document from her binder. The document is titled, in clear text, Jayapal Pramila Search History. Let me explain what that means. In the days leading up to the hearing, members of Congress had been allowed to go to a secure DOJ facility and review the unredacted Epstein files. This is how Massie and Khanna had found the redacted names. The review was restricted. 4 available computers, DOJ staff present in the room, no congressional staff allowed to assist. Lawmakers who went through this process, it turned out, were logged in under their own names. Every document they opened, every file they searched, was tagged to their account. And the Department of Justice had compiled those search histories, printed them out, and sent Bondi to the hearing with them in her binder, apparently so she could anticipate what specific documents specific members might ask about and prepare counter-arguments. Representative Jayapal, whose search history was visible in the photograph, confirmed that the document matched exactly what she had searched. She called it surveillance. She called it spying. She told reporters she had spoken directly with House Speaker Mike Johnson about it, and that he agreed with her that it was unacceptable. That's where the story moved from unusual to something else entirely. Johnson is not in the habit of publicly criticizing the Trump administration. He is, by any fair description, one of the most administration-aligned speakers in recent memory. But on this, he was direct. He told reporters it would obviously be an important line that's crossed if the DOJ was using lawmakers' search histories against them in hearings. He said members should obviously have the right to peruse those at their own speed and with their own discretion. He said he didn't think it was appropriate for anybody to be tracking that. Republican Representative Nancy Mace of South Carolina confirmed independently that she also knew the tracking was happening. She said she'd found evidence of it herself because she knew where to look. She said there were DOJ personnel monitoring her as she sat at the computer. She called it creepy and disturbing. She escalated further, formally demanding that Bondi testify before the House Oversight Committee specifically about the surveillance. And Massie, who had by this point already called Bondi a failed attorney general in front of cameras, made the point that the most charitable explanation for the tracking, that it was a security measure to protect victim information, collapsed the moment Bondi showed up to a congressional hearing with those search histories ready to deploy as opposition research. 3 Republicans, 3 different shades of the same objection, and 0 backtracking. The DOJ's official response was that they log searches on their systems to protect against the release of victim information. That's the stated reason. But the photograph exists, the document is real, and the question that nobody in the administration has answered is, if the purpose was to protect victims, why did Bondi bring Pramila Jayapal's search history to a congressional hearing in her binder? Pull back from the specific details for a second, because I think there are 2 stories happening here simultaneously, and it matters to keep them separate. The first story is the Epstein Files themselves. What Massie and Khanna found when they went to the DOJ building, that men listed as potential co-conspirators were redacted, while victims' identities were in some cases exposed, is not a partisan complaint. It is a factual description of what was in the documents. The Epstein Files Transparency Act was signed by Trump. The mandate was clear. The DOJ missed the deadline, released a partial set of documents, protected the names of the accused while exposing the names of the abused, and only corrected specific redactions after being publicly identified and shamed into doing so. Massie's line at the hearing, "This cover-up spans decades and you are responsible for this portion of it," is the kind of thing that, in a different political climate, would be front-page news for a week. He's saying that 4 administrations, across both parties, have participated in protecting the people who hurt these children. He's saying that Bondi is not uniquely culpable, but that she is currently responsible. He's saying this from a place of documented evidence, not political opposition. The second story is the institutional one. What the search history revelation adds is a dimension beyond the Epstein files specifically. If the Department of Justice is monitoring which documents members of Congress read while conducting constitutionally mandated oversight, and using that monitoring to prepare counter-arguments for congressional hearings, that's a different kind of problem. That's an argument about the separation of powers, about whether the executive branch can surveil the legislative branch's oversight activities, about whether the act of reading a government document in a government facility can be turned into a liability. The DOJ's legal defense of the practice, we log searches to protect victim information, might be technically accurate for the system design. But the moment that log got printed, labeled, and placed in a binder of opposition research, the stated purpose and the actual use separated completely. Speaker Johnson appears to understand that. Mace appears to understand that. Massie described it as the most charitable possible explanation, collapsing under the weight of what actually happened. There's a congressional letter from February 13th, signed by the top Democrats on both the Judiciary Committee and the Oversight Committee, demanding an immediate end to the search tracking, a full accounting of which members were monitored, and an explanation of exactly how that surveillance data was used in preparing Bondi for the hearing. It cites constitutional separation of powers doctrine and Supreme Court precedent protecting legislative activity. It notes that the DOJ's own invitation letter to members mentioned logging the dates and times of reviews, but said nothing about tracking individual searches. That letter is now pending. The DOJ Inspector General has been asked to investigate. No formal Republican response from leadership has been announced beyond Johnson's public comments. Here's what I keep returning to when I think about what the Massie moment actually means. Trump has endorsed Massie's primary opponent in the 2026 midterm elections. That endorsement was made specifically because Massie has repeatedly declined to simply fall in line. He voted against some of the administration's priorities. He pushed for transparency on the Epstein Files even when leadership preferred to let the issue fade. He demanded accountability from Bondi on a law that Trump himself signed, in a hearing that the administration apparently viewed as an opportunity to perform loyalty rather than answer questions. Bondi called him a failed politician. The administration has already signaled it wants him replaced. The insult was not spontaneous. It was on a flashcard, which means someone made a deliberate decision to prepare that specific attack against a member of their own party before he even asked a single question. That tells you something. It tells you that the administration had already categorized Massie not as a Republican, but as a problem. Not based on what he said at the hearing. The flashcard was prepared before the hearing. Based on his months of pressing the Epstein Files issue. Based on his refusal to accept 3 million pages as a sufficient answer to the question of whether co-conspirators are being protected. And the response to him raising that question under oath was not a factual rebuttal. It was a pre-written insult, delivered from notes, in a hearing room with Epstein survivors seated in the front row. What the Massie moment reveals is something that's been true for months, but hadn't been stated quite so plainly in a nationally televised setting. That asking the right questions, documented with evidence, from inside the party, about a law the president signed, can still get you treated as an enemy. The relevant variable isn't whether your question is legitimate, it's whether asking it creates friction. So where does all of this go? The immediate pressure points are several. The Inspector General investigation into the search tracking has been formally requested. The question of whether that practice constitutes a constitutional violation, surveillance of legislative activity, will be decided either in court or in committee, or both. Republicans on the House Oversight Committee, including its chairman James Comer, have said they want answers. Johnson has gone on record. The political pressure to provide a more complete accounting of the tracking program is real, and it's bipartisan. On the Epstein Files themselves, Massie made a point that I don't think has gotten nearly enough attention. He told reporters that the next Attorney General, not Bondi, the one that comes after, can bring charges against people for violating the Epstein Files Transparency Act if it can be shown the DOJ deliberately withheld required documents. That's not a hypothetical. That's a specific legal theory, grounded in a specific law, stated publicly by the lawmaker who co-authored that law. It means the redaction decisions being made right now are not consequence-free in perpetuity. They're being made in the context of a record that can be reviewed. The broader pattern, Bondi attack from inside her own party, from the Speaker's office, from Republican members with no obvious motive to create friction, suggests something about the sustainability of the current approach. An attorney general who arrives at oversight hearings with a binder of pre-written insults, who tracks the reading habits of congressional investigators, who responds to documented legal violations with personal attacks, is operating in a way that at some point generates enough friction that managing the friction becomes its own full-time task. Massie said he doesn't think Bondi has confidence in Bondi. He said someone who is confident enough in their position doesn't need to engage in anything but name-calling in a hearing. That's a specific psychological observation, not just a political attack. It's the kind of thing that, once said out loud, is hard to unsee. The survivors who attended that hearing, 11 of them, sitting in white in the front row, stood up when asked by a Democrat to show they hadn't been contacted by Bondi's DOJ about the crimes committed against them. All 11 stood. Bondi didn't turn to look at them, not once in 5.5 hours. Massie turned. He looked. He acknowledged what he saw. And then he went on national television 4 days later and said, clearly and without qualification, that he did not have confidence in the Attorney General of the United States. He's a Republican, 8th term, MIT degree, voted with the administration more times than against it, and he looked at this hearing and came to that conclusion anyway. What does it mean when the people with the most to lose from saying something are the ones who say it? I'm genuinely asking, because I don't have a clean answer. Where do you think this goes from here? And what would it take at this point for any of it to actually change? Drop your take below. I want to see what you're seeing.